And yeah, what do you think, Noah? Should we go ahead and get started? Oops.
Yeah, that sounds good. Sorry, I was muted.
No worries. Awesome. All right. Thanks, folks, for being here. So we'll go ahead and dive in. Yeah. So on the next slide, I believe we have our statement of solidarity. So before kind of jumping into the content of today's workshop about digital publishing, we do want to acknowledge that the pandemic and other structural inequalities have disproportionately affected people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people. So as members of the UCR community, we stand with Black Lives Matter and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities against racism, xenophobia, and the human rights violations that we've seen happening this past year and well beyond. And we also want to call out and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Diseño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. And while we're currently meeting virtually, I do invite you all, wherever you're located, to learn, if you're not aware, whose ancestral lands you're physically located on at the One Resources native-land.ca, which is on the screen here. So essentially, and welcome to those who are just joining us. You know, for this workshop, absolutely do what's best for you. Feel free to engage any way you're comfortable, and I will be monitoring chat. You're always able to follow up with us if you'd like afterwards. So yeah, with that, we'll go ahead and move on to kind of talking about what we're going to talk about today, and also introducing ourselves. So I'm Rachel Starry. I am the Digital Scholarship Librarian here at UC Riverside Library, and I'll let my colleague Noah introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Noah Trassi. I'm the Digital Assets Metadata Librarian at UCR Library.
So today, and again, I will pop the link to our slides in the chat if you'd like to follow along with the links that we have in the slide deck. But essentially today, our goals are kind of twofold. We want to talk about some of the available web publishing platforms for digital scholarship, for sharing your research more broadly online, particularly research that kind of goes beyond the traditional maybe static text or two-dimensional image sort of types of research materials. So we'll talk about a variety of different types of platforms, and then we'll also kind of provide some resources for the process of selecting one platform over another for different kinds of projects or different kinds of research materials that you might be working with. So next slide. So before we kind of dive into that, because digital scholarship is kind of in the, well, digital publishing is in the title of the workshop today, I did want to kind of call attention to the definition that we are using for this phrase digital scholarship here at UCR Library. So we're kind of using this as a way to describe the process and use of different digital tools or methods for a variety of scholarly activities, including research, teaching, and publishing. And we actually have an alternate definition too on the next slide that kind of acknowledges the fact that across disciplines today, folks are engaging with different kinds of software, different kinds of tools and platforms. So, you know, not only does the kind of end product of your research materials and scholarship matter, but also that process. So, you know, we are defining digital scholarship as the process of creating new, often fluid forms of scholarship using these digital tools and computational methods, in addition to kind of using that as a phrase to describe the, you know, constantly changing products of that sort of technology dependent research. For what we're going to talk about today, we're going to kind of walk through and briefly talk about 4 different categories, different types of tools that are available for you to share your research and scholarship. And we all are going to kind of talk through these different types. And since 3 of them, content management systems, static site generators, and multimodal publishing platforms are all kind of just ways of describing different types of websites. We will get into a little bit about how websites work and kind of thinking through the process of, you know, assembling all of your materials to share if you were building, for example, a digital scholarship, you know, project site or something like that. And then, yeah, we'll look at a couple of examples of those specific tools and actions and think through that process of, you know, actually making the decision. And so with that, I think I will hand it over to Noah to talk. We have actually we do want to hear from you all, of course, before I pass it over to Noah. So if you're interested in learning about something really specific today, or if you came because you saw a particular tool in the description, or if you're, kind of just generally interested, we'd love to hear from you all. So feel free to introduce yourself in chat, ask questions throughout this workshop hour in chat. And yeah, if you want to kind of share where you're coming from or things that you're interested in learning about today, we'd love to hear from you. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Noah.
Hey, thanks so much, Rachel. So like Rachel said, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about like what even is a website. And we're doing this not because we don't think you all know what websites are, but because often it can be really helpful in these conversations to start with the basics and to make sure we're kind of on the same page and kind of thinking about the building blocks that go into the tools we're talking about. So for our purposes here, when we're talking about a website, we're talking about a collection of web pages that are grouped under a shared domain name. So my silly example here was if your domain name is coolsite.net and you have a bunch of pages there, you might have one that's like coolsite.net/about, coolsite.net/pictures, so you have all these different pages, but they're grouped together under a domain name. They're usually linked to each other. And then those pages are published on a web server, which is a computer that you either have locally or in most cases now in the cloud. So it's a computer in a data center somewhere else that's publishing it out to the internet. And then people can access it using a web browser. So you're starting off with your collection of pages, publishing them on the server, and then people are accessing them with the browser. So you might have noticed in that definition, we just kind of kicked the can by calling it a collection of web pages. So what's a web page? The core piece of a web page is an HTML file that we've got in the middle here. So that's what is defining the content and the structure of the document. So not only is it containing the text of the page, it's also containing structural elements like headings, tables, things like that. And then all of these other elements are things that most websites have, but you don't necessarily need all of them to have a website. So you have things like CSS files that handle the visual layout, the kind of the styling and presentation, like colors and fonts. You may have JavaScript files that are doing things to create dynamic and interactive elements. So it might be animations, audio, video players. Maybe on your website, people can submit a form and it is validating or processing the data in some way. All kinds of things. Those are just a few simpler examples. Then you might have also media files. So that would be, any other kind of files that you have embedded, linked in your web page in some way, images, sounds, videos, documents, all kinds of things. And then there's databases, oftentimes relational databases. So if you're familiar with SQL, that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. If you're not familiar with SQL, no worries. That's the only time we're gonna probably mention it today. And databases are storing structured data used by the web page. So for example, if it's a website where you can look up what the current weather is in your location, it's probably storing a bunch of data about the weather in a database behind the scenes that the website is then querying when you make your selections. So we'll also talk a little bit about static sites versus dynamic sites, which are terms that are sometimes used to kind of group websites into two categories. So a static site is when your web server is publishing pages as is. So basically, you create your HTML files, any of your other files, and then you just publish them. Usually they're simpler sites. They may not be very interactive for the user. And the editing experience is also a little different from what folks might be used to. So it often means you're not working in a dashboard, you're directly editing HTML files or other text files. And some of the benefits of that approach is that it is not very resource intensive when it comes to computing resources. So it can be a lot cheaper to host, a lot easier to maintain. You know, there's usually nothing to upgrade. And it can also be a lot easier for people to access if they're in situations or parts of the world where their internet access is limited. So it'll load a lot more quickly. On the other hand, when we're talking about dynamic sites, which is probably the more common kind of website, especially for big sites, the server is using a database to generate pages on the fly. So there's a lot more complexity to what the server is doing to create the pages before the user sees them. It can change or customize itself quickly and often, and it'll also often come with a friendlier user interface for editing content. So something like an administrative dashboard that you can log into behind the scenes and edit in your browser. In comparison to static sites, the hosting and the ongoing maintenance can be more complex and expensive, and it can sometimes be more difficult for people with limited computing resources to access. So here's a couple of examples of the two kinds of sites through a digital scholarship lens. So if you have a digital exhibit as a static site, it would probably display the same image and text content to all the users that visit the site. Users can browse and search the site, but they might not be able to do much else. And behind the scenes, you have a developer. It might just be one developer, or it might be a small team updating the site by directly editing the image and text files. So if you wanted to add a new image, you would have to go put that image in a certain folder on the computer. If you wanted to edit text files, you would have to open them up in a text editor. Versus if you have the same kind of premise of a digital exhibit as a dynamic site, it could look a lot of different ways, but one way might be that users can view images on interactive maps and animated timelines. So you have more moving parts and more complex displays on the site. Users also might be able to create accounts and put together their own custom collections of images that they can save. And maybe you have a team of researchers a team of researchers who don't necessarily have a lot of technical expertise, but they're writing and editing all of the content in a pretty friendly dashboard behind the scenes. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it might make a little bit more sense once we get a little further along. So when we talk about hosting, that's the piece where the website lives on a server that's published out to the world. And that can kind of be divided into self-hosting, meaning you're managing more aspects of the hosting yourself, or third-party options, which would be it's hosted somewhere else, somebody else is doing more of the management. And there can be differences in, it really depends on the specific project, the specific situation and the site, but there can be differences in complexity, in cost, and in kind of how much control you have over your site. So when it comes to self-hosting, there is, depending on where you are, there may be some local institutional infrastructure. So like it used to be more common for universities, for example, to provide some space for students and faculty to create and host web pages. Currently, if you're at UCR, what we have for that is Google Sites. So it's a little different from just plain web hosting, but we'll also talk about that a little more in a bit. Another option that we wanted to point to is called Reclaim Hosting. And they're a web hosting provider that works a lot with higher education and digital scholarship. They have relatively low student and faculty rates. I think I pay for a faculty plan that's about $50 a year for however many websites I want to make. And it comes with some different kinds of tools for installing things like WordPress or Omeka. And then when it comes to third-party hosting, this is where you're really not directly involved in the management of hosting. There's a lot of options out there, but a few examples are WordPress.com, Omeka.net, and then the USC instance of Scalar. So that's the kind of thing where you are creating an account. You're kind of like a user on someone else's services, and you're not having to deal with as much of the nitty-gritty of server maintenance or management. So something that we really wanted to point out is that even if you build a website with open source tools, the web hosting is a separate issue. So I think on the next, So I think maybe this will become a little bit more clear when we talk about content management systems next, but when you use commercial services where the tools and hosting are kind of bundled together, so that would be things like, for example, Squarespace or Weebly, you have to be a little cautious there because it may be hard to get your data out later. So what is a content management system? This is the first kind of website we're going to talk about, or kind of publishing tool we're going to talk about. So a web content management system, also known for short as a CMS, is a tool for website authoring, collaboration, and administration. So it's a dynamic site that uses a database to manage digital assets. It uses a graphical user interface for content creation, editing, arrangement. So that means, like we were talking about with dynamic websites, you're logging into a dashboard in your browser to edit things. It often relies a lot on templates and plugins to customize your site and accomplish different kinds of tasks. And it doesn't necessarily require you to know HTML or CSS to create your site. So some common open source content management systems you might have heard of are WordPress is a really popular one. There's also Drupal. Mukutu is one that was created specifically for Indigenous archive and museum collections. There's Omeka also is one more generally for library archives, digital scholarship exhibits. MediaWiki is what is for creating like wiki style websites, so similar to Wikipedia. And then Ghost is actually one I'm not as personally familiar with, but I believe it's similar to WordPress or Drupal, used for blogging and general websites and things like that. So we're also going to show for each one a couple of examples of sites created with each kind of tool. So for WordPress, we're going to check out the site of the First World War letters of HJC peers. So let's see. Can you all see the browser, or do I need to?
Yes, it looks good.
What's that?
Yes, it looks good. We can see the browser.
Okay, awesome. So this is a digital history project from Gettysburg College that was created using WordPress. And you can see you have this homepage that has some context. You have some of these different features like an embedded panel from a Twitter account, and this word cloud of tags. And then we've got letters. So they're organized under soldier profiles. So you see that there's images and text that are arranged using this kind of custom schema. They have links out to other sites. And of course, we're not going to be able to get too deep into it right now. You can always follow the link from the presentation on your own to look around more. Let's see. So they have some maps. So I think what you can see here is that WordPress is a pretty flexible tool. It can do a lot of different things. You know, you can see with this site, they were really able to implement all of the different features for the way that they wanted to, except it looks like their Zoom might not be working for this map. But you know, they were able to kind of organize things in a variety of ways with the maps, soldier profiles, timelines, and people use WordPress for all kinds of things, you know, for personal websites, for blogs. You often do, like I mentioned in the last slide, you do have to rely a lot on templates and plugins. But as kind of a trade-off for that complexity, there's really a lot you can do. And even though it's not a specialized digital scholarship tool, people have certainly adapted it and made really wonderful sites for digital scholarship. Let's see. So the next one that we're going to look at is an Omeka example, which is also from Gettysburg College. And this one's called the Vietnam Memory Project. And this is, so Omeka, like I mentioned, is a content management system that's really designed for digital exhibits and digital scholarship. So, so it kind of makes more of those decisions for you upfront about how things are structured. So you can see this is a site where members of the community can contribute digital items related to the Vietnam War. And so it's like a crowdsourcing kind of project. Since Omeka is a digital scholarship tool, it has some existing plugins to do things like crowdsourcing. They have this contribute an item page where people can upload. And then this browse items tab, this is something that kind of comes out of the box in Omeka, that things are organized as items, and there's some browsing features. So here's an image. You can see they're using more standardized fields here. So this is more along the lines of library metadata standards. And let's see, you've got a Creative Commons license down here. These are the kinds of things that may be a little bit easier to implement in Omeka because it's designed for this kind of content. Again, there's the trade-off with it may be easier to get something simple up and running, but because it has more already built into it, it can sometimes be a little bit tricky to customize. So when is the content management system most useful? It's particularly useful when you need to manage a database of objects. So like you saw on both of those sites, they had pretty large collections of different items. You want to share short form writing like posts or quick web pages. You want some off the shelf functionality, and you want for you and your team to be able to work with a pretty easy to learn interface. So some of the drawbacks, or not drawbacks, but things you would want to consider is you would want to use a CMS when you're not really concerned about site performance necessarily, like how fast pages load. You're not necessarily concerned about your user's bandwidth. You're maybe not necessarily super concerned about the security of the site. Maybe you don't have very sensitive content in it. And especially, I think this is a big one, that you want to be able to collaborate with colleagues or students to co-create a digital project. So you want to have multiple users, they may have different roles and permissions on the site, and you want to all be able to work together. I would say that's where these kinds of tools can really shine, especially in an educational context. So like I mentioned briefly earlier, there are some proprietary web publishing tools that are similar to CMSs in some ways, but also have some major drawbacks. So that's like some of the big ones are Squarespace, Wix, Weebly, and Google Sites. And yes, Google Sites was the one that we did mention that UCR provides, so it's not ideal. And how these compare to open source CMSs like WordPress is that these are typically going to lock you into a particular hosting solution. So if you're creating your website with Squarespace, it's also hosted on Squarespace. They also may not be free to use, or even if they start off free at first, they might charge a fee later. And often it's not going to be easy to export content to other platforms. So, you know, if you want to move your site somewhere else, if you want to, if you're having issues with that provider, it can be a lot of work to get content out and get it somewhere else. I've helped people with this before, and it can be a pretty complex project. So that's what you would want to consider if you're looking at some of these commercial options or have a site there currently. It's not bad. Like in some ways, they've done really great things to make web page creation more accessible, more user-friendly, but like I said, there can be these drawbacks. Okay, so our next kind of way of publishing that we're going to talk about is a static site generator. So this is a tool that creates static sites, the ones we talked about where the HTML is just published as is. So the generator is a tool that can automate many steps of building a static site. And compared to a content management system, it can require a bit more technical knowledge to implement, but it is still more efficient than just creating a website totally from scratch, writing HTML by hand. So how the workflow usually works is that you create your content, usually following some guidelines or templates that come with the generator. So you may be doing it in Markdown. It might just be plain text files or CSV spreadsheet files, but kind of working in these more simple file formats. Then you would run the static site generator tool on your computer to turn that data into HTML pages. And then once you have your HTML pages, you upload them to a server to be published on the web. So that might sound a little complicated, and it can be, but there also are some major advantages when it comes to cost, maintenance, accessibility. So some tools that you might have heard of or maybe haven't heard of that are open source static site generators are Jekyll is probably the most popular one. There's also one called Hugo that's fairly popular. A couple to know about in the digital collections realm are two that are called Collection Builder and Wax. these are based on Jekyll, but they're designed specifically for building digital exhibits. So these could be potentially a static site alternative to something like Omeka. And then we have a few others listed here, Gatsby, ViewPress. They all kind of do similar things. So as an example of a site built in Wax, let's check out this New College screen print site from New College of Florida. So you can see, similar to Omeka, we've got this homepage with a description. This is a collection of printing screens. We have this browse feature down here because, like I said, it really is designed for digital exhibits and browsing images. So you can click on these different tags and it'll load different sets of images. And then when we go to check out the image, it's in this viewer where it also has some standard, fairly standard metadata. Some of it is customized. If you have ever heard of IIIF, that's a specific standard that libraries and digital scholarship projects sometimes use for sharing images on the web. We don't have time to get fully into it, but if that is something that you're interested in, it's good to know that Wax does support it. Let's see, and then this other example using Collection Builder, which is the other digital exhibit static site generator, is called Voices of Gay Rodeo from the University of Idaho. This one's really cool. They're all cool. But this is, you can see they've done some cool stuff on the homepage with these speech bubbles and the background images. And then if we go to the menu panel over here, we can see there's an about page and there's a list of interviews, oral history interviews with different people. If we click to the page, we've got an image, we've got a transcript. So yeah, this is also, like I said, one that's a bit more customized for specifically digital scholarship and library tape projects. And you can see that a static site, it doesn't mean it's not interactive at all. Let's see, if we check out the visualizations here, they've done some interesting stuff with visualizing different topics in the interviews. But it does mean that things like fancy animations or user submitted content, that would be harder to do. So for example, like we looked at with the Vietnam War site where they were having users submit content, that's something that would be harder to do with a static site. So when is a static site generator most useful? You may have a complex project or publishing workflow and need to really get in there to customize your site's functionality. You might not have a very large collection of materials to manage, or those materials like images, audio-visual files are already hosted elsewhere. You or somebody that you're working with has some web development experience. You may want to streamline site updating and maintenance. So like you're willing to put in more development effort up front to have less work updating and maintaining down the line. It's also useful when performance is a concern. So the speed that the site will load for the users, and especially if you want to share content with users who have barriers to internet access. This is going to work better for those users. And now, I'm going to pass it over to Rachel to talk about 2 more kinds of publishing tools.
All right. Yeah. So the next type of tool we want to talk about is multimodal publishing platforms, and that is kind of a catch-all to describe several different types of tools for online scholarly publishing. These are primarily platforms that are intended to be used for long-form scholarship. So think about perhaps kind of online editions of monographs or books, but those that kind of pair long-form text with interactive or embedded multimedia content in particular. So this word multimodal, we're just kind of using that. It's kind of commonly used in the library and digital scholarship spheres to talk about like layered multiple modes of sharing scholarly content. So moving beyond, again, just maybe text narratives or 2D images to include all different kinds of scholarly content and media, and kind of juxtaposing those next to each other. There are a lot of different publishing platforms out there. Some of the ones that we wanted to kind of call attention to today include Manifold Scholarship and Scalar. So we'll look at examples from those two. You may also have heard of PubPub. That is perhaps less explicitly focused on the juxtaposition of different kinds of media and text, but it's a great kind of interactive platform for peer review, for publishing long form scholarship with different types of materials alongside of it. And then Fulcrum is actually one from the University of Michigan. So it is another sort of publishing platform that allows researchers to share both monograph-like texts as well as different kinds of interactive content. So we're not going to look at an example from Fulcrum, but there are, just to kind of point out that a lot of different university presses and federal funders are funding and thinking about projects like these to allow researchers to kind of move beyond print. And especially for folks who have data sets, who have visualizations, who have all sorts of AV materials that you want to kind of include and share as part of your research. Scalar is perhaps the most well-known among this kind of category within the world of digital scholarship. So there is a project here from Lehigh University called Women of the Early Harlem Renaissance. And it is a project that kind of has narrative, scholarly narratives about African-American women writers from the early 20th century. But what's really unique about this particular platform is its focus on multimedia. It's allowing you to kind of pull together all different kinds of multimedia from different places, different types of media, and kind of structure them in a unique way that's maybe non-linear. So you can use these sorts of multimodal platforms like Scalar to share, for example, online editions of books or monograph-like research objects, but you can also kind of go beyond, just chapters in a book to kind of lead folks through your content to allow folks to explore the materials that you're sharing in maybe nonlinear ways. And there's also, if I go to the, I believe maybe it's the homepage. There is, the introduction page. Scalar and other platforms like this are going to kind of include different sorts of tools. So Scalar includes support for interactive visualizations. So this is a kind of network graph that's being drawn. Each point in the graph is a piece of content, and then it's color coded. So, this includes all the different pages and essays in this project. It includes every image or audiovisual, file that's included in this project. So you can kind of include and embed lots of different things, maps. It's a very flexible platform, but again, it's kind of going beyond other sorts of content management systems. So things like Scalar kind of count as part of that category, but they generally allow you to kind of customize a little bit more and may have different kinds of, some of them are particularly for scholarly audiences, whereas other content management systems, as Noah mentioned, like WordPress, have a huge beyond kind of higher education audience and user base. So Scalar is a really fantastic resource that's actually created by folks at USC here in Southern California. But then Manifold is a another similar sort of platform, and it is a project that's collaborative between the University of Minnesota Press and the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York City. So for example, this is a platform that lets you publish in non-traditional formats. Essentially monographs is their focus, but it kind of like Scalar allows you to juxtapose and do different things with content and multimedia beyond what either a content management system lets you do, or especially beyond kind of traditional print publications. So you can use a platform like this in similar ways to PubPub and other platforms in this category to do peer review, to have kind of annotations and crowdsourcing, and in terms of like peer review and commenting, and it allows for kind of a more robust scholarly ecosystem of kind of like, commenting on each other's work and stuff. So that's a really useful aspect of this. And then in fact, if we go back, if I click on this link again, it would be the fastest way to get back here. Very frequently, you can use tools like this to include additional resources and in fact juxtapose different kinds of resources. So this particular book includes different kinds of image collections, different resource collections that go beyond, again, just two-dimensional images, to include video games that you can download and play on your own computer, or collections of videos. Folks will do oral histories and audio files, things like that. So another sort of platform that does something similar. So when is a multimodal publishing platform most useful? So again, a lot of these kind of fall within that content management system or overlap with that category, but these are particularly designed for when you have long form writing projects with a lot of narrative, and particularly when you want to kind of juxtapose or layer your narrative in linear and nonlinear ways with lots of multimedia objects. A lot of the platforms, like we saw with Scalar, allow you to kind of embed complex visualizations of the content that you're displaying, as well as annotations, commenting, things like that on top of and alongside narrative text. And this is a great kind of category of options to consider if you want to really customize the way that your readers and users are kind of interacting with the content that you're publishing. And then finally, the last category we're going to talk about today is scholarly repositories. So this one is kind of an outlier, whereas the other three categories that we've been talking about today have been more along the lines of websites that you are building in different platforms or with different tools to share non-traditional, non-linear, maybe digital collections of scholarly materials. Scholarly repositories, on the other hand, are a bit more focused on, sharing either pre-published stuff or things that are in static form. So there's, different kinds of scholarly repositories, essentially for storing different kinds of, academic scholarship, research materials, or data. So there are different kinds. There are institutional repositories. So at the University of California, we have what's called eScholarship, and that is the institutional repository that all UC campuses share and that all UC researchers can upload their research materials to. There are also disciplinary repositories, both for research in different formats and your data. So for example, if you are in history or in archaeology or in different fields, there are going to be discipline-specific repositories for data sets and for research materials that folks are sharing that pertain to the research data and scholarship of that particular discipline. And then there are also repositories specifically for research data. And it's kind of important to note that different repositories do place limitations on the kinds of materials that you can use that repository to share. And while most of them are intended as platforms to make scholarship open access and openly available, others are sometimes used for protected storage locations, right, for sensitive research material. So they really kind of run the gamut between kind of open and closed, but essentially they share in common that they are curated locations for kind of long-term preservation and access of research materials. So again, eScholarship is the institutional repository that we use here at UCR and across the UC system. So in addition to being a fantastic location where you can upload preprints or postprints of your previously published research, like journal articles, things like that, it is also itself a publishing platform. And we host several journals on this platform. So this is the Journal of Citrus Pathology, which is an example of a journal that's being hosted through eScholarship. So it is a fully open access and international peer-reviewed journal publication that you can browse if you wish. We also have a Journal of Undergraduate Research here at UCR. So it's a really fantastic platform that is kind of managed through the California Digital Library. And then we also here at UC have a data-specific repository. So researchers at UCR can upload data sets to DRYAD without having to pay any kind of data curation fee. It is a platform that's used by other institutions, and essentially it kind of, it's different from perhaps, uploading data to a site like GitHub or other, perhaps non-academically focused repositories or places where folks share data, in that it has, curators kind of behind the scenes who are doing this quality control, who are ensuring that, when you're sharing your research data, it's being shared with the appropriate, information about the data that will make it possible for someone else to kind of reuse it to ensure that you're kind of meeting funder compliances, things like that. So it is, again, a really fantastic option if you are here at UCR or in another UC campus. And then there are other scholarly repositories that kind of are not specific to an institution. Maybe they're specific to a particular discipline or scholarly community. So Humanities Commons is an excellent example of this, which it, I believe, began initially as MLA Commons. So it was a kind of community location for members of the Modern Language Association or Modern Languages Association to kind of come together, share their research material, share their teaching materials. So folks use Humanities Commons not just for, uploading kind of previously published stuff, but there is all kinds of scholarly content that is being shared and published on here. So there's different collections of materials. I clicked into this one on musicology. But essentially what's kind of nice and different with this sort of scholarly repository compared to, for example, eScholarship, is it's not really limited to the kinds of materials that you can upload. So you can share, your course materials, you can share conference papers, code, and digital projects as well. So it can be a great place to kind of find and connect with researchers across different disciplines or within your kind of disciplinary community as you're publishing and sharing your materials. And another fantastic resource for finding disciplinary data repositories is called Re3Data. So this is the registry of research data repositories, and you can search for particular research or repositories, or you can browse by subject, content type, if you're looking particularly for, audio, oral histories, or, particular kinds of data sets, or, by country, if you're looking for different regional sorts of data or governmental data, less likely governmental. There may be governmental databases indexed in here, but you can also browse by subject. So this index of repositories includes everything from the engineering and natural sciences and life sciences to humanities and social sciences disciplinary data repositories. So another fantastic place to kind of either share or find research materials. So when is this particular solution to kind of sharing your research online most useful in comparison to the other three that we looked at today? So this is a particularly good use case for when you do have previously published articles that you want to share an open version of. So usually that's a pre or post print, pre-print being pre-peer review, post being post peer review, but before, you know, the journal has officially kind of formatted it for publication, so pre-publication version. Repositories are also a great place either to store research data or other kinds of supplemental research materials. Again, if you just need to make a collection of something, you know, kind of accessible or store it for long-term preservation. And it can also be a good option, even if you do utilize one of the other three sorts of platforms we talked about today, to initially create a digital project or share something like a collection or an exhibit. You might consider creating static snapshots or versions of your data, of your digital scholarship projects, of your publications, and using a repository to store those for kind of the long-term preservation, storage, and access to those materials. Because of course, platforms and tools become obsolete regularly. And so Noah talked about this a lot earlier, but we kind of, again, want to reiterate. And we talked a lot today about primarily open source tools. And there can be a trade-off, as Noah mentioned, between the kind of initial investment in both time and energy, you know, the effort to either find collaborators or to develop your own expertise in using particular open source tools. And that can seem really overwhelming or significant compared to the out-of-the-box functionality of a lot of the kind of commercial or proprietary platforms. And I think Noah mentioned this several times as well, where it's really, really important to kind of consider your options is if you do ever need to migrate your site or export the content from a platform, it can be a lot more challenging to do that from something that is bundling everything together and kind of forcing you, like Google Sites or like Wix or Squarespace, to kind of utilize the software as a service tool and hosting bundled sort of platform. So in the last couple of minutes today, we wanted to kind of take a step back, and because we threw out a lot of different example projects, example platforms and tools. So if you are kind of in the process of needing to decide on a particular tool, or whether you have kind of ongoing projects that you need to migrate or want to explore other options, you know, what are some of the kind of questions that you might ask yourself to kind of make that process a little bit easier? So we have 3 questions that we kind of recommend. So the first one of these is, you know, thinking about what are the materials that you want to share. Different types of digital publishing tools and platforms, maybe tailored towards, again, short form narrative versus long form narrative. Certain tools might work better with particular types of digital assets, whether you're working with images or AV materials or other types of materials like 3D models. Different platforms allow you to kind of use different viewers for different kinds of multimedia materials. It also matters kind of whether or not this is the first time you're sharing this particular sort of thing. Again, repositories may or may not limit the sorts of materials that you're uploading. So it might differ if you're using previously published stuff versus, you know, unpublished materials. And of course, there are different options for sharing research data. It's also super, super useful to kind of reflect on and really have a conversation with your collaborators and any, you know, folks you're working with about that, the purpose and audience, right? Because that also plays a huge role, I think, in this process of making a decision between the different, you know, platforms that are out there. So whether you are developing a project that is for, you know, kind of personal or professional purposes, different platforms have different affordances if you're using them for teaching, or if you need students to be able to kind of interact with them or co-create on them. Again, if you're curating things versus like curating multimedia versus sharing previously published articles, things like that. And of course, if you want your users or your readers to be able to interact in particular ways, that is worth considering too. If you want crowdsourcing or other kinds of kind of community engagement built into the functionality, then you might be leaning more towards content management systems or multimodal platforms versus static sites or vice versa. And then finally, it is also incredibly important to kind of consider, what are the support and resources that you need to do this, and which are available to you. So consider, both the technical infrastructure that might be needed for the hosting of these different platforms. And we can also talk about that more if folks have questions about particular, how would I even get started, creating my own scalar site sort of thing. Also, what technical expertise do you and your collaborators have, or the local experts, in the library or other, campus units that you'll be working with. Of course, again, how much time it takes both to learn to use the tool and create something with it, but also over time to update and maintain a site. Again, one of the tremendous benefits of the static site generators being maybe a more streamlined long-term maintenance workflow, even though the kind of upfront building workflow might be more complex or take more time or expertise. And of course, funding that's available. Yeah, for the tool itself, for the time of folks who are building it, and the long-term maintenance and hosting. So we here at UCR Library are kind of just getting started building a new digital scholarship program. So we definitely encourage you, if you are interested in this space, if you have questions about particular tools or have project ideas, or maybe this is really overwhelming and you're not even sure where to start, we would love to have those conversations with you. So definitely feel free to reach out, and we've got a couple of minutes left. We'll stick around for a little while if folks do have specific questions that we could answer. But thank you all for being here, and I really hope that this was some useful information. I will paste in chat again the link to access these slides, which is also on this slide. And then really quickly before folks hop off, it would actually be really, really helpful. We have a very quick, the second link that I just shared there was a very quick 2-question evaluation form, because we always want to kind of check in with folks if this was meeting your needs, if you or have additional topics you would like us to cover in future workshops, things like that. So if you have a minute to click on that second link and take our really, really brief survey. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Sorry, Noah.
I was just going to repeat, thank you all so much for joining us. I know it was a lot of information. Hopefully some of it kind of got you started thinking about different options and different paths. And again, like Rachel said, if also you're totally overwhelmed and confused, that's okay too. And we can keep talking and kind of be there to provide more support.